everybody will stay. We'll wait a couple of minutes for people to come in, and then we will begin. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to you all. My name is Daniel Reinhold, and I'm the Dean of the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. And I take great pleasure in partnership with Koren Publishing in welcoming you tonight to this special event marking the publication of the new Magerman Edition Koren Tanakh. The appearance of a new English translation of the Tanakh by a publishing house of the stature of Koren is always going to be a notable event for Jews around the English-speaking world. So this is, of course, a celebration of that, but it is also a measure of the significance of the Bernard Revel Graduate School that I'm proud to represent, that we can partner with Koren tonight and present to you a panel consisting of a Revel faculty member, Professor Koller, a Revel doctoral graduate, Professor Yael Landman, and a current Revel doctoral candidate, Binyamin Goldstein, all of whom were sought by Koren to contribute their expertise in various ways for this new translation. So tonight comes to you from two Jewish institutions, both proud to be at the cutting edge of contemporary Jewish studies, while also using that expertise in the service of the international Jewish community. Professor Shalom Holtz, also Professor of Bible at Revel and Yeshiva College and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs of Yeshiva College, will be moderating tonight's discussion, and I'll be passing proceedings on to Professor Holtz momentarily. But first, given that our attempts to run this event with live participation from Koren, founded on the rocks of the 7-hour time difference, we have instead a short 3-minute message for you. So hopefully, this will be Matthew Miller of Koren Publishing, who you will be hearing from momentarily.
The Magerman edition of the Koren Tanakh is one of the most significant publications in the Jewish world of our generation. To undertake a new English translation of Tanakh requires chutzpah and humility in equal measure, but neither more than yirat shamayim. In translating God's words and those of his prophets, one assumes the precarious position of mediator between him and the reader, searching for the formulation that will do his work the greatest measure of justice, while simultaneously bringing the reader closer to the text. Whilst there are already numerous English translations of the Bible in the Jewish world, ours aims to stand out through its emphasis on authentically conveying the Hadrat Kodesh of the original Hebrew. In attaining our goal to create a translation which is readable, accurate, and true to the Hebrew in both tone and integrity, we are incredibly grateful to a number of people. To Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb for his sage advice and guidance, as well as his incomparable scholarship. To Jessica Sachs, Sarah Daniel, and their team of translators, without whose incredible talents this edition quite literally would not exist. In particular, to Doctors Aaron Koller and Yael Landman, and Binyamin Goldstein, from whom we will be hearing shortly. And of course, to my friend, mentor, and Rebbe, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rabbi Sachs's translation of the Torah and much of Tehillim, featured in the new Koren Tanakh, is the project to which he dedicated most of his efforts over the last decade. His profound learning, moral depth, and sheer eloquence expressed in his many printed work made him a leading religious figure not only within contemporary Judaism, but throughout the world. His untimely passing, just as this edition went to press, was an irreparable loss to the Jewish people. But we take a small measure of consolation in the knowledge that this brilliant translation, to which he devoted his final years, will help carry on his legacy for generations to come. We at Koren Publishers are honored to have been Rabbi Sachs's publishers, his students, his friends. We are also grateful to the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University, its faculty, its graduates, its students, not only for their contribution to this edition, but for their unending contribution to Am Yisrael and Torat Yisrael. We are so pleased that this monumental work is already the subject of such wonderful discussions, and that it is bringing traditional study of Tanakh into the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
So with thanks to Matthew Miller from Koren, without further ado, let me introduce you to Professor Shalom Holtz, Professor of Bible at Revel in Yeshiva College and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Yeshiva College. Shalom.
Okay, thank you, Dean Reinhold. I'm just going to say a few words about why we're doing this at Yeshiva University. Daniel already mentioned that our three panelists are and their contributions to this particular, to the Magerman edition. I'll just add that if one opens the front cover, the introductory material, you count, by my count, something like 15 people, including our panelists tonight, with some connection to Yeshiva University, starting, of course, with Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, who was the Crisell and Efrat Family University professor at Yeshiva University, but continuing on through several other members of our faculty, as well as our numerous alumni, some of whom are here. I'm the odd man out in this case. I'm not neither an alumnus nor a contributor to this undertaking, and so I opt to moderate. We have in front of us our panelists tonight. You've already met them. Our Professor Aaron Koller, Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University, Dr. Yael Landman, who is a lecturer of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania, and Binyamin Goldstein, who is a doctoral candidate at the graduate school. The way I envision our conversation tonight, and this isn't a game show, we've actually given the people questions in advance, so they've had a chance to think about it. The way we envision the evening, we'll start by talking a little bit about the process, about how did this translation come to be, and what the role of our panelists was in it. And then we'll talk a little bit about Yeshiva University's contribution to this and our panelists. And then finally, we'll talk about it as a phenomenon of history, and how does it fit into the broader Jewish constellation historically. We'll hold questions for the end, and at that point, I'll signal I'll welcome people to put their questions in the chat. And then they'll be moderated. Dr. Reinhold will be monitoring the chat for questions as we go ahead towards the end. Okay, so on to our discussion then. All of you panelists are credited in the introduction as translation scholars. That's the term that the Koren publishers use, who, according to what they say, invested many hours reviewing draft translations and providing the translators with valuable corrections, translation guidance, and textual and historical insights. And Dr. Koller, you worked on Sefer Shoftim, on the book of Judges, and Esther. Dr. Landman, you worked on Sefer Nahum, and Mr. Goldstein, you worked on Sefer Shmuel and Sefer Divrei Hayamim, both parts of both books. So starting with, let's start with Dr. Landman, if you don't mind going first. Your role in the process once you received the draft translation. What kinds of corrections, guidance, insights did you give? Did you operate with any guiding principles of your own or of the publisher? And then we'll ask this question. People can, the panelists can feel free to jump in at once Dr. Landman has given a little short answer.
Sure, thank you. So I think it might actually be helpful to begin by reading a little quote from one of the initial emails from my back and forth with Ashira from Koren. So she said, when you are reviewing, she asked me to bear in mind the nature of the translation that they're seeking, which should be contemporary, flowing, poetic, with appeal to a broad segment of the population, and that they allow the translators a certain amount of liberty when it comes to consistency and syntax, and place a higher priority on English style. So I think it's important to understand, first of all, that there are many different ways to go about translating. And for the case of this translation, it was important, for me as a translation review scholar, to bear in mind what Koren's goals were. So I think that, I'm guessing the other, my fellow panelists may have found a kind of similar experience, that we received a translation. In my case, I received Daphne Renbaum's translation of Sefer Nahum. So she wrote a translation, and she also included some questions and notes in the translation asking, what do you think of this? Does this work? Does this not work? And I, first of all, addressed her specific questions head on, but otherwise, I really did exactly what Koren says that we did, which is to offer textual and historical insights. So sometimes this meant that I saw something that I thought veered too far from a standard of poetic license with syntax and consistency. For example, the addition of words in the translation, which were meant to clarify a very difficult pasuk, but which I felt just added material that was not reflected in the original, and that was, that took a little bit too much liberty. So that was one kind of correction that I suggested, and that usually was taken. So I'll let my fellow panelists add to that.
Okay, so Mr. Goldstein.
My experience was very similar to that of Dr. Landman. The only thing that what could I add? In terms of corrections, something that I found interesting was not only in terms of biblical scholarship or additional words, as Dr. Landman mentioned, but I found myself making some corrections in terms of the realia of ancient Near Eastern life, and the way those were the way those were translated and the way those were expressed in English. Maybe I'll get to an example of that later.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that was an interesting aspect of my experience.
Well, why don't you give us the example now?
Oh, sure. So in discussing the shipping of the wood, King Hiram of Tyre was shipping the wood to the cedar wood to David, and the translator translated it as cedar wood, which I thought was, if not imprecise, it gave the wrong image of what was happening in the minds of the reader, because wood was shipped in the form of logs or saw logs, timbers, and not wood, which I think would give if someone said cedar wood, I would think boards, finished boards of cedar. So I said I would, not to be nitpicky, but shipping of wood occurs in the form of timbers or saw logs, and I would either leave it as cedar or translate it as cedar timbers or something of that sort.
So not finished product is the point?
Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay, got it. Because we have here, I mean, we deliberately did not give everybody's CV, but we have an expert on wood cutting and so on in Professor Koller here, but we're not going to get into that. We promised we're not going to get into that tonight. But Dr. Koller, do you have anything to add to the process or anything on the process, if you want to give an example, or you want to just talk a little bit about in general terms about the process and how it worked?
Yeah, if it's okay, maybe I'll just elaborate a bit on something that Dr. Landman said, and that's that there are, I think, different legitimate philosophies of translation, and this is sometimes couched in terms of literal translations versus literate translations. Professional translators tend to talk about formal equivalence versus functional equivalence. So going from a language like Hebrew, an old Hebrew, to modern English, one has to decide somewhere on the continuum between a sort of rather stilted translation, which is going to come off as not great English, but mirroring the Hebrew to the extent possible. And everyone recognizes there are limits to that, but that they're somewhere closer to that of the spectrum, all the way to a much more flowing literate translation that literate translation that may be in fact excellent English, but will hide the fact that there's a Hebrew original behind it by perfecting the English to that extent. And as Dr. Landman said, the instructions we got made it clear that the goals were certainly on that latter end of the spectrum, that they wanted a beautiful flowing literate English rather than literal. So I should say, and I said this, when I was first in touch with them, this is going back 5 or 6 years, that my own preference, actually like a fairly strongly held preference, is for the opposite, is for as literal a translation as possible. And I actually got great terms for this and a sort of expression for this from Franz Rosenzweig, who loved translating and actually spent his honeymoon translating Birkat HaMazon. I don't know how that affected his relationship, but it talks something about his priorities. And he writes, and really, I think a really insightful passage, he writes that if he gets a business contract from an associate in Turkey and he brings it to a translator, he wants the cleanest, most accurate translation possible. He couldn't care less whether you're catching the nuances of the original Turkish. He just wants to know in good German what exactly he's agreeing to in this contract. Whereas if he gets a letter from a beloved friend who's traveling in Turkey in Turkish, then he actually wants to hear the expressions. He wants to hear the contours of the language. He wants to hear the nuances, and he'd be very happy to actually get a German that sounds Turkish in its cadence, because he really wants to hear the voice of his friend in that letter. And so, I said, putting my cards on the table, like I think that is actually the preferred answer when it comes to biblical translation. Also, I much prefer a translator to preserve the Hebrew as much as possible and to get an English that makes it clear that this is not the original. This is not the best piece of English literature ever written. It is explicitly a translation, and partly that's pedagogical. I actually, especially for our community, for my students, but for our community more broadly, I want them to go back to the Hebrew. I want them to be sent back to the Hebrew, to not be allowed to forget that this is a translation. And I think this is something that Jews have as opposed to Christians in particular, have long thought important in biblical translations. So I think that was part of the give and take. So as Dr. Landman said, there was a point person, and I said, here's my actual my belief. Like I don't think we should be going for such a literate translation. And she said, well, look, these are the guiding principles, but you should push back whenever you feel like you're, if it's going too far. So you say, and we can feel free to disregard your opinions. So okay, that's fair. So I'll give you a quick example. The Hebrew Vayetze LaMilchama in the draft that I got was translated, he launched an attack, and with a note that said, this is bolder and more vivid than a literal translation. And I wrote, it is bolder and more vivid. That's exactly the problem. Like, I don't want bolder and more vivid than the original Hebrew. I want the original Hebrew. Like it says, Vayetze LaMilchama, these are really basic words. So, I think in that case, this panel sent me back to go check whether they accepted my comments, and in that case they did. And it says now he went out to war repeatedly, which I think is the right call. I'll give you another example on the other side. I actually tried to get them to take out the word judges as the name of the book. I was like, well, shoftim, in ancient Hebrew didn't actually mean judges only. It also meant judging in a judicial sense, but also meant leaders. Shimshon is not a judge in the sense that English judge means. So can we change the book to the name of the book to something else? And that was rejected pretty quickly. So sometimes they went with traditional over what I thought was more literal than literate.
Okay. So Dr. Landman, do you have any examples that you want to give us of something where either that where you saw your work reflected in the translation and a change, or where it didn't reflect that? Where you would have done something differently?
There we go. Sure. So I'll give you an example, and recall that I worked on Nahum, which is prophecy. It is poetic. It also has a lot of very powerful images and difficult language. Now, one example is that in chapter 1, verse 8 in Parak Aleph, Pasuk Chet, the Pasuk says, Uvishetef over kala ya'aseh mikoma. And the translation originally read, he will come as a ravaging flood and bring an utter end to this place. So I noted that this loose translation could work if it said uche shetef over, meaning with the comparative, but that as a translation for uve shetef over, it introduces an equation between God and the ravaging flood that isn't there in the Hebrew. And in my mind, this kind of deviation is a very loaded one, because it is theologically fraught. It's a way to conceive of God, and you may find that elsewhere in the Tanakh. But if the Pasuk itself does not say that, then I would not introduce this kind of God imagery, which especially is, I think, significant because of the various ways that different deities from the ancient Near East are associated with different elements of nature. And when you start equating God, even in metaphor or what have you, with these different elements of nature, you're entering that conversation, which I think was not going on in this pasuk. So she did change the translation to with a ravaging flood, he will bring, etc., instead of he will come as a ravaging flood. So again, I mean, this is a case where we're talking about translating one letter, which may seem negligible, but I think in this case, it is actually very fraught theologically, literarily, and historically. So I was happy to see that this change was accepted. I guess, if you want an example where my feedback was not fully accepted, so in the second chapter and then in the second verse in Parak Bet, Pasuk Bet, it says, Allah mefitz al panaich. So something, the mefitz, rose up against you. Should the mefitz here be understood as a scatterer, someone who disperses, which in this case would refer to a victor in war who defeats their enemy, in this case, Nineveh, at this point, capital of Assyria. So is this understood as a case of victory in battle and then deportation? Or is mephitz a kind of tool or weapon along the lines of the way that the word is used in one pasuk in Mishlei? So Daphna originally translated, "The battle crusher is rising up against you." So I thought that was an interesting translation, first of all. So I actually looked up this term battle crusher because it looked interesting and also unfamiliar to me. And I found that if you Google battle crusher, or at least this was the case when I worked on this, a few years back, the only results that I found were for a Game Boy or Nintendo game. So I said, if you do want to go with this translation, with this understanding of mephitz, you might want to choose a different word for the, kind of tool or weaponry. But I also suggested that she consider translating along the lines of scatterer or disperser, understanding the root as, pevav tzadi instead of as napatz. And I thought that that worked nicely contextually, and also because of the prepositional phrase that it's grouped with in the pasuk. So, this was both a contextual and a syntactic argument that I made. But the translation now reads, "The hammer of war is rising against you." So in this case, my comment about the battle crusher was accepted. My suggestion to go with a totally different translation was not.
Mm-hmm. One is reminded here, I remember when I first saw one translation, not in this context, but that the phrase in the Psalm, "Vayachileu mechelev chita," right? And that is rendered in some versions as cream of wheat, which is likely to be the source of this breakfast cereal name, right? It probably does actually harken back to that. The question now is, can you use it anymore without that image of the red box of cereal coming to the mind of the reader? So the battle crusher is a great example of that kind of a thing. Like, what happens to the English language? One of my teachers used to say that to translate is to have a love affair with two languages. And that's part of this whole thing. You have to kind of be aware of the nuances. So Mr. Goldstein, you talked a little bit about the Atzei Arazim, I guess, right? And that you had, and they did accept your rendering, or didn't they? Or
in that case, they did.
They did. Is there an example if they didn't?
Yes. There were a few interesting examples where they did accept my suggestions, where they did, the translation was, I felt, a little bit too free or poetic, as both Dr. Koller and Dr. Landman were saying. For example, in 1 Chronicles 17:10, where God is communicating a prophetic message to David via the prophet Nathan, and he says, "V'ichnati et kol ovecha," and the original translation read, "To you I will grant repose from all your enemies," for "V'ichnati et kol ovecha," which is it's a nice phrase, but doesn't really hew to the original, to the sense of the Hebrew. And I suggested they stick with, "And I will subdue all of your enemies." Another case is 1 Chronicles 5:26, where you have "Vaya'ar Elvei Yisrael et ruach Pul melech Ashur vet ruach Tilgat Pilneser melech Ashur." So you have sort of what's recognized by scholars as a gloss, possibly a gloss. The chronicler, the author of the text, might be conceiving of Pul and Tilgat Pilneser or Tiglat Pileser as two different people, but historically, we know that these refer to the same person. So we have to treat the vav in vi'et as a for pleonastic, a meaningless vav, and treat it as a sort of parenthetical. And God roused the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, the spirit of Tilgat-Pilneser, the king of Assyria. In terms of examples where the final translation or what my suggestions were not accepted, there's a particularly good one in 1 Samuel 13:1, where the very perplexing Hebrew reads, Ben Shana Shaul b'malcho, Ushte Shani Malach al Yisrael, following the normal accession formula for kings, which occurs, I think, more than 30 times throughout the Hebrew Bible. But there doesn't seem to be a number there. Or if there is a number, it's 1. And Shaul certainly was not 1 when he became king. And it's unlikely that he ruled for 2 years. So the original translation that I was sent read, Saul was, and an ellipse in parentheses, years old when he became king, and he had been reigning over Israel for 2 years, verse 2, when Saul selected 3,000 men from Israel. So I believe JPS and NJPS and the new JPS translation both stick with that tact in translating this textually difficult verse. They assume that a number has fallen out. That's one way to go about translating this. I suggested that they stick with that and have a note that other ancient versions have other numbers, and there are various ways to deal with this. The note was not included, which I think was a little bit of an oversight, perhaps. And the text was translated a year past before Shaul became king, which, although grammatically problematic, it does lean on some traditional Jewish exegetes. So if they're taking that route, that's certainly a route to take when you're translating texts.
Okay. So you bring us to the question of the footnotes, because we have you here, and you're of the 4 of us in the room here.
Dr. Koller wanted to
add something. Yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind. Sorry.
Yeah. Sure. It's impossible to see this with. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. His point's a really great point, and I think he's pointing to a further, I think, legitimate question of what is a problem for the translator to answer and what is a problem for the commentator to answer. And we did get, there are some notes in the Tanakh, and I understand, there is, I think Koren has big plans for this translation. So there will certainly be editions of this that have more extensive notes. And, there are already the Land of Israel Tanakh, which I think has 2 volumes, including Shmuel already, certainly has very extensive notes. But in this Tanakh, there are, minimal notes. And it's an interesting question when problems need to be solved by the translators. I think Mr. Goldstein's example, there was a real problem in the text, right? The text literally says that Shaul was 1 year old when he became king. And that seems impossible to pretty much all readers ever. So you can translate it literally. A translator doesn't have to solve that problem. A translator can just translate it and say, look, the same way that a commentator would have to solve the problem reading Hebrew, now a commentator has to solve the problem reading the English. I didn't have to solve that problem for you. I don't have to make that easier in English than in Hebrew. I had one example of that in Shoftim, where in the story of Shimshon, after he gives the Philistines a riddle, and it says they couldn't solve the riddle for 3 days, Vayihi bayom hashvi'i, and then there are some more days, and they only had 7 days to begin with. So clearly there's something confusing about the Vayihi Bayom HaShavi. It was on the 7th day in the middle of it. And the translator had translated something like, as the 7th day loomed near or something. And I said, look, that's not what it means. I mean, I totally get what you're doing, but that's not what it means. It says on the seventh day. So the finished edition actually has on the seventh day with a note that says that according to some commentators, this means that the Shabbat was the fourth day of the week. So the fourth day of his 7 days was Shabbat, therefore it's called Yom HaShavi, which I think is perfectly appropriate division of labor between the translation and the commentary. The translation is literal. The problem remains. The commentary says, look, we all know that when you're going to read this, you're going to see a problem. Here's one possible solution to that. So I very much like that idea of splitting up, not solving problems in the translation that are there in the original, but having notes when you feel that they're needed. If you think a reader is going to suspect that you just made a mistake or something, then like, yeah, say that this is really what it says, but here's a possible interpretation. So I think Mr. Goldstein's example is a great example of that, and it's a shame there isn't a note there to explain what that 1 year or whatever may mean, or like what the Hebrew says.
Right. So the question of the notes in general. So it's of all of us here, Mr. Goldstein was the only one who also served as a footnote scholar for the same 2 books, same 4 books, however you want to count them. And the purpose of the notes, according to what they tell us, is to point out elements of the original Hebrew that don't come across in translation or can't come across, or to provide other crucial background information. So we've already heard some examples of notes. How did that process work? Mr. Goldstein, you'll comment on it because you were involved in it most directly.
So many of the points, that the verses that eventually got footnotes, which if you look through the print edition are very few, were originally marked as needing notes by the translators of the texts that I received, Sarah Daniel, and she marked off many verses. She said, this is going to need a note. And there were many other cases where she did not mark off a verse indicating that it would need a note. And I felt that a note was necessary. One example of a note that I feel is exemplary in its necessity is in examples of blasphemy, where the Masoretic text uses a circumlocution with oive. For example, in 1 Samuel 25:22, where David says, Ko yasa Elohim la'oivei David v'cho Yosef, instead of le David or Li. So the note says, this is a circumlocution. That's not blasphemy per se, but in 2 Samuel 12:14, Efes kini etz ni'atzta et oivei Hashem. There you have a circumlocution to avoid an otherwise point of blasphemy. So the note there has that this is a circumlocution, and it refers to God. The other possibility is for the translator to eliminate the circumlocution and translate, I guess, literally with the meaning of the speaker. But actually, in many cases, in terms of biblical measures, for example, when there were many notes that just explain the correspondence between biblical measures to modern day measures, a tact that the translator could have gone with is just translating the biblical measure. Instead, they went with, let's say, hin, and they translated hin as hin, and then there was a footnote explaining, translating hin to a modern measure. I personally would have liked to see more copious notes, on a translation of this sort, where there was a lot of sort of free translation to get a more literary feel. And there were a lot of instances of departure from the Hebrew where the departure was not noted. But yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to move on a little bit now to the quick break, and just mention I've just got a notice in the chat that we're actually privileged to have David Magerman here with us. So in fact, we can thank him, virtually, or however one does that these days. And we're going to continue on now with just a little bit of a question about what it takes to get to this point, what training it takes to get to this point, to be invited to be part of this translation project. So if any of you, I'm not going to ask anyone specific, but anyone wants to start, please do, of the panelists, at some point in your work on this project, did you feel like you were drawing on something that you had learned very specifically, or even more generally from your training as a graduate student, in our program? So somebody unmute him or herself.
I'll pipe in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I think, one of the really great things at Revel was that, in addition to offering, advanced biblical Hebrew in the way that, most serious biblical studies graduate programs would, there were also advanced courses in biblical Hebrew syntax and biblical Hebrew semantics. And having all of this kind of, very, very deep knowledge of biblical Hebrew grammar and the mechanics of biblical Hebrew and how it's written was something that I found critical in being able to assess and really contribute to this kind of translation. So that's sort of one piece of it. And the other piece that I'll mention is that, as I mentioned, the book that I worked on was Sefer Nahum, which happens to be addressed to Nineveh of Assyria. And having knowledge of ancient Assyria and the ancient Near Eastern world was also critical in this case in particular for understanding certain nuances in the text. So for example, there's this one pasuk in the first parak, it's a pasuk Yud Gimel, which originally translated Ve'ata eshbor motehu me'alayich. And it originally had, and now I will break your bonds of slavery to him, which I thought was, very nice idiomatically and made a lot of sense. But I commented that in this specific case, in this context of a prophecy to Assyria, I would maintain the more literal translation of a yoke, because this image is bound up in other prophecies relating to Ashur and also to Assyrian imagery. So there are these reliefs with scenes that depict the deportation of people from their, homelands to other places. And the way that these scenes portray the people is like the cattle who are depicted alongside them. So the image of a yoke here that goes on, the shoulders or back of, oxen or other cattle is actually, very poignant. So in this case, the translation was changed to reflect this, which I think, maintains that very loaded background.
Okay. And you got the word tafsirav in Nahum. So there's a nice Assyrian loan word for another time. Okay. Anyone else on that one? Yeah, Aaron, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of quick things come to mind. One is that I think it's true that Jewish translators over the centuries have assumed that our job is to translate the text as we have it in front of us, the so-called Masoretic text. And there have been translations, modern English translations, that in the context of translation amend the text like repeatedly. I think one famous example is G.R. Driver's New English Bible. And Driver, this is the, for those of you who are worried about the Driver scholars, this is the younger Driver, who's, I mean, dead many decades by now, but who amended all the time and put that into the translation. And the translation, if you sit with the Hebrew and the English, you sometimes wonder how he got it. And like there are notes where he explains that he's changing the text. And Jewish scholars, I think, have not done that. And certainly in Revel, I think we teach and believe strongly in a strong respect for the Masoretic text. And so working with that text is certainly part of the training and something that comes to the fore in this translation. Another thing that I think related is that we never do biblical studies in a vacuum. There's a long history of Jewish biblical interpretation, and whereas all scholars of the biblical text will read, modern scholarship from the last century or so on biblical text, we in our own teaching and what we expect students to prepare also involves the long history of Jewish biblical interpretation. So insights from the Rishonim can be incorporated when there are difficult passages that need some work. Doesn't mean that we're not trying to translate literally. On the contrary, it means that there were very smart people 1,000 years ago who were trying to figure out what does this text mean, assuming that it stands as it is. And sometimes the solutions are sitting there waiting for a modern translator or scholar as well. And then the last thing I'll say is that it is somewhat, I'll speak for myself, but I'm sure that Mr. Goldstein and Dr. Landman felt the same. It's humbling. The history of, especially in modern times, where we know, but in pre-modern times also, when you think about Jewish translators of Tanakh, and I certainly do not mean to put, with all due respect to Mr. Goldstein and Dr. Landman, I don't mean to put any of us in the same category, but you have people like Saadia Gaon and Mendelssohn, and I don't know if you want to be in the same category of either of those. You can pick which one you want to be with. But then in more modern times, people like Ephraim Speiser and H.L. Ginsberg, these are the translators of the new JPS translation. And these are great biblical scholars whose names loom very large now, many decades after their work. And so one gets the sense, and I think we do owe David Magerman a debt of thanks for this. This is a once in a generation opportunity to retranslate the Bible from scratch. Being part of that is no small honor. Even if I played a very, very small role in it, it's a unique opportunity. I don't expect to do this again in my lifetime. So that's certainly part of it. I think there's things to think about in terms of who was involved in the different translations, but that's just one last comment on that.
Shalom, you're muted, sir.
We're getting closer to the point where people are beginning to experience Zoom fatigue. So I want to move over, and Aaron's point is actually one that we could, offers a nice transition to the question of the place of this translation as work of, in history, because any of such translation and such undertaking is going to be of historical moment. So it does break down a certain barrier that we're used to thinking of, between scholarly work aimed at an academic readership on the one hand, and the needs, if you will, of a community. And I'll add here that the preface to the translation says it is, quote, faithful to the classical Jewish interpretive tradition, while cognizant of contemporary scholarship. Well, that's, at Revel, we're talking about that all the time. And it's something of a balancing act, right? It's a beautiful sentence, but really doing it could cause some, cognitive dissonance, if you will, or tension between faithfulness and cognizance in your contribution. Did you experience that? Did you feel that there was some point where you said, where? And if not, how? Why not? So we'll start with Mr. Goldstein, since he didn't answer the last one. You could also pass.
I'll take it next.
Okay. Yeah. So, Yael, you want to go first, or you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. So, well, you asked about a few different things here, so I'll just, address some of this. Like, first of all, I think the fact that Koren went and sought out a team of scholars to contribute to this speaks volumes about, the set of priorities that informed this work. And I think also, that I think that we've all kind of made clear that, there are these different tensions when it comes to translation between different priorities, and it's very hard to kind of satisfy all of them. But part of what I think Koren sought out to do, as I understood it, was really to create a work that, would not just be a translation like any other translation, but that also is a translation that people who want to learn Tanakh can use. A translation that would be, that would create a really meaningful user experience. I mean, that is part of how I understood the mission, which is different from the mission that, someone else might have. And I think that, first of all, like, to be clear, the different choices are okay, and scholars make different choices. And I think, this is a translation that can really be learned. And part of what I think also is something that I noticed, having worked with a book that is poetry, is that the translator I worked with paid great attention to the sound play, to the use of alliteration and assonance, to use, repeating consonants and vowels. That it is something that you don't see in most translations. So, for example, I teach Intro to Bible to a class of 65 students who mainly have very little background in, Bible generally, and most of them do not know any Hebrew. Everything's in translation. So when I'm teaching about biblical poetry, there's this challenge to try to show how language is used and how sounds are used. And I've compared for them different translations to show how most of them do not preserve any of these like beautiful uses of sound play in the original. So I think this is something where, I saw in the book that I worked on that there was a real effort to preserve that, which I think will retain part of this kind of meaningful user experience that someone is able to have when they understand Hebrew and are able to read the Hebrew. So when they go ahead and read the English.
Okay. Any other panelists want to jump in on this one? On this question of the either the user experience or, yeah, Aaron, go ahead.
The user experience, I've been reading it at length, but I haven't used it with students yet, so I don't want to offer an opinion. But your question reminds me of, again, in the sort of history of Jewish biblical translations, the new JPS that Mr. Goldstein mentioned, which is not new anymore, it was finished in the 60s, was done by the Jewish Publication Society with a committee of scholars translating. And they had 3 rabbis on the advisory committee, one Orthodox, one conservative, one Reform. The Orthodox rabbi actually taught at YU. His name was Harry Friedman. He was, all I can find out about him is that he was an Australian. He taught at what was then Teachers Institute for a few years at Yeshiva University, and then returned to Australia. And I wasn't able to find out too much more about him. But one of the reasons that there wasn't someone more prominent on the committee is that when JPS was planning that, we have Solomon Grazel, who was the editor of JPS, wrote to the president of the RCA, who was then Rabbi Theodore Adams, asking for Orthodox participation in this new project. And Rabbi Adams, of course, asked Rabbi Soloveitchik, and Rabbi Soloveitchik's answer, which has been published in the volume of letters that Natty Helfgott edited, said, we representatives of the Torah Sheba'al Peh community in Judaism cannot participate in such a project where the goal is to make a more exact rendering in accordance with, this is now a quote, with the latest archaeological and philological discoveries, because our job is to infuse the spirit of Torah Sheba'al Peh into the English version. And not, so he certainly saw a tension. I really thought a lot about like, what would that mean? Like where would you see that? Like which psukim would I check to see whether there's more of a spirit of Torah Sheba'al Peh or more of a spirit of latest archaeological and philological discoveries? And there's some like, obvious ones that probably come to mind, like how long should the Eved Ivri be a slave for in Mishpatim? It says V'avado Le'olam, but the halacha is that he's only for 6 years because Vayikra says 6 years. So certainly JPS, but also the new Koren, the Magerman edition says a slave forever. So I don't know if Rabbi Soloveitchik would like that or not, but it's certainly not trying to correct the literal interpretation by Torah Sheba'al Peh. So I really thought a lot about like, what would that look like and where would these tensions be? And I'm sincerely unsure. I mean, there are a handful of cases where I think it's clear that the translators or the footnotes in the Koren now in the Magerman are aware of what we might call traditionalist questions. A quick example I happened to notice the other day, I was actually teaching Nehemiah, and in Nehemiah, the people go and gather what seem to be 5 minim for Sukkot. Which don't exactly match the Arba'a minim that we have in Sefer Vayikra. And the translation sort of takes the 5th one to be a sort of summary, like all those 4 are leafy branches. So it's sort of it seems like a way of resolving this in a traditionalist way, which I'm not criticizing. It's not illegitimate, but it certainly seems to be part of it. Also, that denominationalist issue that Rabbi Soloveitchik was putting his finger on is also something that I wonder about here. There's, the JPS is the translation of choice in the Eitz Chaim Chumash in use in conservative synagogues and in the Reform synagogues, and there's a whole bunch of other versions of it, but it's never been, I don't know of any Orthodox shul that uses JPS, even though, there is a bilingual edition. So, this is, as Shalom, you pointed out when we were talking about this, it's never officially an Orthodox translation, but there may be something to that as well. This is, at least also an Orthodox translation, or, with Orthodox concerns maybe higher in mind than JPS had, for example. Again, I'm not really sure what that looks like tachlis. Like, I don't know what the nafkamina is about an Orthodox translation versus a non-denominational translation. But that seems to be something that looms large in at least planners' minds. I don't know whether it looms large in translators and scholars' minds.
Right. So you actually set me up here for what's interesting to me. What I did preparing for this was I actually read some new book by Leonard Greenspoon. I think his name is Leonard. I forget. Greenspoon's book on English Bible and on translations, right? And one of them, he has a whole chapter on English Bible translations. Fascinating to me. And I had some correspondence on this with Aaron in the back and forth. It took about 200 years before Jews did anything in English. 200 years after the King James, right? Which means that for a long time, they were pretty satisfied with simply producing. The most that happened was that they put the Hebrew next to the King James. That was the Jewish use. That was Jewish English translation. At some point, people began to make modifications, but they were really never deep modifications. They were, the kinds of things that Aaron mentioned, the Avado Le'olam, for example, gets them back and forth in English, but it was mostly because it was British Jewry trying to fit in to England. And remember, this is in England, it was a culture that had thrown them out. And they were just coming back in the 17th and 18th centuries, but it took an American to really, just pull the plug on the King James as the English translation for Jews, that began with the Jewish translations, the Jewish Publication Society's efforts. So to me, it's also a fascinating, what would an Orthodox translation look like? Should it be, but remember, as Aaron said, right, they don't actually, the Magerman edition is you have to scratch the surface a little bit before you realize that this is an Orthodox undertaking. So it's not pitched as an Orthodox translation, yet it's very clearly, that's clearly part of it. So let's wrap up with that and just thank our panelists. If there are any questions, I mean, some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat already have been kind of alluded to. Daniel, if if anyone has any further questions, I'll happily, please put them in the chat, and Dr. Reinhold will, just let me know what's going on there.
Yeah, so a couple, as you say, were.
Okay.
I think you've seen. There was a question that I don't know our panel can answer necessarily, which is how consistency was achieved, but I'm not sure that's something that necessarily, please tell me if so, but that's probably not something that our panel would necessarily know about in this particular instance.
Unless anybody does, I don't know. Does anybody?
Yeah,
anybody...
and if you do, please do. Yeah, Yael.
Yeah, I can mention, I can't answer that question fully, but I am aware that, I was working with one translator. There were many other translators, but that there was some editorial committee who, all of these translations went to. So I imagine that at that level, there was attention to that kind of, concern. Beyond that, I can't say.
Okay. So Mr. Magerman has a question here, yes, right?
Indeed. Go ahead, Shalom.
Okay, yeah, so you can read it as well as I can, but midway through the project, I saw a draft of the book of Kohelet with pages of translation notes, much longer than the book itself, justifying the word and grammatical choices. Did you see those kinds of translation notes, or did you just see translations? Panelists, were there notes with your translation, with what you got?
To a certain extent, there were notes, but they certainly weren't longer than all of Samuel and Chronicles. Yeah, in many cases, they were justifying translations and word choices, but they were maybe, on average, maybe 4 to 6 lines of notes per page.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, there certainly was those notes were clearly meant as a conversation. I don't know who I was working with. I should look in the published edition. At the time, it was like studiously kept anonymous from me. I don't know if you had a different experience. I was always sending notes to Ashira, who then I would come back, and the emails would say, the translator, she or he has said the following. Like, it was very explicitly not for me to know who I was talking to. I haven't actually checked to see
Sarah Daniel, according to the introduction, says here. Okay, for a Shoftim.
Yeah.
And for Esther, I don't know. Esther, it says here. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
But,
yeah.
Right. In any event,
Jessica Sachs.
This was very much it sounded to me like a conversation. Like, there were many notes that said, I did the following for the following reason. What do you think about this? Here's an alternative I was playing with, and things like that. So those notes were clearly not meant for publication. There was, I think, an awareness, and this is something that I think probably every translator laments. It's like, at the end of the day, there are lots of passages that it's very hard to be absolutely sure that I have the right answer, right? Like, if you tell me I have to choose, I'll choose. But I know that, there's a 70% chance this is right, there's a 30% chance this is right, or there's 3 possibilities. I'm not really sure. So notes are really helpful. If you're allowed to include notes, you can say, like, well, look, that's what I'm going with, but here's an alternative that I think has the following advantages, but has the following disadvantages. And I imagine that the translators, lamented not being able to include some of that thought process, because there was a lot of thought that went into some of these translations. It wasn't like they were just like throwing things against the wall and hoping that the scholar has signed off on it. They had worked hard and considered certainly, what was in the Mefarshim. Lots of notes referred to different traditional commentators and said, I know Radak says this, maybe that's a better translation. So that was part of the back and forth. I don't know whether there's, again, like the publication plans. I don't know if there's plans for fuller notes than there are here. Someone I saw asked in the chat about a Chumash version. That would certainly be a place for it. There's a Shul edition that has longer, more extensive commentary, not quite as long as the Land of Israel Tanakh, but something that's 1 volume. So that's certainly a place where you could have more extensive notes, but I don't know what the publication plans are. And I personally would love those kinds of thoughtful discussions to be reflected, because again, I think it's really important for our community to actually look at the translation not as a final polished work, but as an approximation. Look, none of us is native speakers of biblical Hebrew, so here's a good translation, but here are the problems with that. Here's where we might translate it differently, and think about that. I find that educationally really important, but also communally and identity-wise very, very important. Like to not take our eyes off the fact that the Hebrew is actually, you know, as Mr. Miller said at the beginning, like, you know, if we're aiming for Dvar Hashem, so you know, he didn't speak in 21st century English. God didn't speak in 21st century English, and that's something I think we ought to, you know, not take our eyes off of. Sorry for the he.
Okay, right. I think any other, I'm not seeing very much here, news-wise, question-wise, if there are no further questions.
A question about whether using past translations that this translation worked to correct specific things that maybe anybody picked up on.
Did you feel that you were correcting something that was elsewhere in the, you know, a mistake in the, let's take it as in the JPS or in the other Orthodox translations that are out there that shall remain? You know, there are other translations that are out there. Would you feel you were correcting anything, or, you know, making sure you weren't saying something else?
No, I think that, look, I think your last ellipsis is actually an important point. The modern Orthodox community has shifted to ArtScroll, which has, you know, again, this is on the one hand a legitimate choice, but also a very, very clear ideology in its translations. More pronounced in some passages than other passages, but it makes no apologies for it. And to be honest, ArtScroll doesn't call it a translation; it calls it an elucidation. It's certainly not trying to reflect the Hebrew carefully. It's trying to tell you what Hashem really meant in writing this, and you know, that's channeled through tradition and so on. And you know, the fact that modern Orthodox shuls have sort of ceded the shelf space to ArtScroll in the last few decades is, I think, a real cause for concern educationally and in terms of the identity of the modern Orthodox community. So, like you said, Shalom, it's not explicit. Like the societal goals, sociological goals, are not explicit in the Tanakh, and I was never told if there are or not. But certainly, that's one reason that I actually, you know, was happy to sign on, was that I think there is an important corrective to make here. That, you know, if there is an Orthodox translation, or at least a translation that is you know, vaguely under Orthodox auspices and acceptable to Orthodox community, and is not just translating according to Rashi, but is trying to incorporate you know, good philology, good translation, incorporating Mefarshim, but also modern scholarship, like, great, that can actually, you know, serve an important purpose for our community. So yeah, I think that's certainly something that does.
Excellent. The question of did anybody know, you know, I mean, I don't think that there's a big question about the biblical text that they were using. I presume it was the Koren text that they were using. But what I find fascinating, and just to kind of conclude things, is that how different this is from what I know about the JPS translation in terms of process, right? Because in the JPS, the stories that are told is that they got together once a month and they sat around and discussed, you know, X was charged with translating chapter number 3, presented, and it was his translation, right? There were no women involved at the time. So there's a big step forward with this translation. But the point is that that there was a man who translated, and a group of men discussing that translation. And then they upped or downed a translation, and that's what ended up in print, which is very different from what we have here, where the translator is almost anonymous, right? Until you read the beginning, but almost anonymous, and the scholarly work is just as anonymous, right? You know, kind of behind the scenes, and you get this, you know, picture out here, which is a different way to go. You know, we're not here to judge it. Actually, we decided that this is not a review panel. You know, we're not going to say up or down on this translation. I don't think you could really do that on a Bible translation of this nature. You know, here it's good, there it's not so great. So with that, I'm going to thank Daniel Reinhold and the graduate school for hosting us tonight, and thank Dov Winston, who did behind the scenes technical work, and who, you know, got us to this point. Certainly I couldn't have handled that. And thank you all for attending. And thanking, of course, the Magerman family and the Koren people for all their help with this. And we'll see you again soon on another Revel event or in class. Good night.
Thank you all very much, and feel free to join us at Revel.